Well, welcome everyone. Just one additional comment. When you do have the mic and you'd have to have a question or you want to engage the panel, make sure to also say your name and the organization that you're with. That helps us make connections beyond this conversation, because we know we only have an hour. So creating opportunities for connection beyond here is good as well. And I wanted to start us off with a little bit, as we know this is Women's History Month this month, and I wanted to present a slide of some of the women who created, is there a button? Just as a reminder of some of the foundation that has been built to allow the opportunity for the Me Too conversation, especially some of the foundation that was built through the laws. So we have Paulette Barnes on here. She was an administrative assistant with the Environmental Protection Agency when she was told that if she wanted to keep her job with the EPA, she would have to enter into an affair with her supervisor. And when she refused that, they fired her. And so she took a case in 1977, which was the first appellate court decision to say that sexual harassment is a form of discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. So that set the first step in the foundation. And then we have also Michelle Vinson, who was the first sexual harassment case to be brought to the Supreme Court. And she was an employee of a bank who was harassed in the work and eventually raped by her supervisor. And when she brought the issue forward to the bank said, well, because you haven't had any economic harm as a result of your rape, this is not a violation of the law. So she decided she was going to take that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the first case in the Supreme Court was Michelle's case to say that sexual harassment at work is a violation of the law and considered sex discrimination. It's hard to imagine that we even had to have that conversation and had to listen to a defense that rape was not a harm to this woman. And then we have also Anita Hill up here, and I remember in 1991, I was in community, I just started my first year of community college. I had at that time already had my own experience as a low-wage worker, both working in fast food and restaurant service, and this was my first interaction with any sense that there was laws around sexual harassment in the workplace. And here, this incredibly professional, poised woman got up there in front of an all-male judiciary committee to talk about the sexual harassment that she had experienced because a Supreme Court judge was being put on the bench who had harassed her. And I remember watching that. And I remember the takeaway that I had was if you bring these issues forward in the workplace, you will have an all-male group of people hearing your story. It will not make a difference, and you will be publicly humiliated. No matter how fancy you are, no matter how well-dressed, well-educated, and poised you are. And I thought I could never do what Anita did, and she did it so well. So how in the world would I bring an issue forward? And then also up on the slide is Maricruz Ladino. She is an agricultural worker, rape survivor, and advocate who is standing in the fields of Salinas in this picture, talking about the abuse of low-wage workers. And so I wanted to highlight some history here on these issues and talk about the leaders who brought us here to make this conversation possible. I think sometimes, especially through the media and the conversation that we have been having, there's an impression given that these are issues that women in tech face, these are issues that high-wage workers face, and that this is an issue of white women in entertainment. But we really also have to recognize that there is a long history here around harassment and that we still continue to see the largest segment of victims to be low-wage workers who have the least ability to bring these issues forward. So with that being said, I want to turn it, oh, and I also want to make one quick other comment. We do have some handouts, and there's a flyer online. We are grateful to have the Sexual Violence Legal Services Organization through the YWCA here in Seattle with some opportunities for assistance if you need it. And I know there's folks from the organization here. Yes, thank you, today. So hoping to have some input. Okay, so I want to start us off with Marilyn, because one of the things that we talk about and we expressed is what is creating the opportunity for the Metoo conversation right now. Like, why is this happening? And I think part of it is a power shift, that when there's demographic change and a shift in power, there's opportunity when we become empowered people to feel like, okay, I remember what happened with Anita. And are we in a different place right now? Can we have this conversation? Am I going to be empowered to have this conversation? And so Marilyn is doing some of the work that's working in community with others to have this equity conversation to give us more opportunity to feel the strength and empowerment to come forward. So Marilyn, tell us what happened this morning and what is going on in our community, because this is craziness.
Yeah, so thank you. It's great to be here and to see the people here in the room, and hi to all of you out there in Webland. So yeah, just this morning, Governor Inslee actually signed into law 5 bills that were passed. Well, he signed a whole bunch of bills, but 5 particularly relevant to this subject that were passed in this year's legislature. So I want to just talk a little bit about those and then kind of what it took to get to this point. So one of them is the Equal Pay and Opportunity Act. This is a bill that it took 4 tries through the legislative process. This is the 4th legislative session that bill was out there. And it finally passed this year. And so what this does is it really adds some teeth and expands Washington's 75-year-old equal pay law. We've had a law on the books since 1943 in Washington state that says you have to pay men and women in similar jobs the same. But we all know that there's still a huge gender and racial wage gap in our country. So what the Equal Pay and Opportunity Act does is it says that workers can actually freely discuss compensation in the workplace. So it gives workers that tool to at least discuss with their coworkers what they make with each other. They can also ask their employer why there are differences in pay and why there are differences in career opportunities without fear of retaliation. And the employer has to be able to provide bona fide job-related reasons, completely unrelated to gender, why there are those differences in pay and job opportunities. And it gives workers the ability to go and make a complaint to the State Department of Labor and Industries rather than having to sue their employer in court. They still have the right to sue their employer, but they now have an administrative remedy, which is particularly important for lower wage workers who simply don't have the resources and ability and wherewithal or likely claims receipt in order to take things to court. And then it really changes the burden of proof. So now it's on the employer to show that they actually had a reason unrelated to gender rather than the employee having to prove that discrimination took place. So this really gives people important new tools. There was also 4 bills directly related to sexual harassment that also passed unanimously through the legislature this year. And again, these give workers new tools. It says that you can't be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement as a condition of employment, and it makes any non-disclosure agreement you may have signed in the past as not valid in terms of testifying in court and those kinds of things. So again, nice, good tools for workers. One other bill that also passed this year after several rounds through the legislature where it hadn't passed, which was not unanimous by any means, was the Reproductive Health Parity Act. This also helps empower women and give women tools in terms of making crucial decisions about themselves. It says that any health plan in Washington state has to provide contraception without copays or payments of any kind on the part of the woman, presumably the man too now, and that any health plan that covers maternity care also needs to cover abortion. So that also is an important thing. So how did we get here? How did we get to the point where we got these pieces of legislation passed this year? The Me Too movement certainly helped. I think women's issues and concerns were really at the fore of the legislative session this year in a way they haven't been before. The Metoo movement, the women's marches that we've seen, the whole resistance that we've seen since the Trump presidency started, I think, really played a role in people's power coming to Olympia this year. Another thing that's been going on for the last several years is that there has been a large coalition effort that has included women's groups, including the YWCA, a lot of labor organizations, other community organizations have come together to build power for workers to get new workplace rights, to pass paid sick days legislation and minimum wage laws in several cities, and then in 2016, the 1433 initiative that raised the minimum wage and established paid sick day standards statewide. That really gave that coalition a lot of power in Olympia, made it so nobody could really ignore us. And it was that power that brought corporate lobbyists to the table last year to seriously help craft a paid family and medical leave bill and get that big piece of legislation passed through the legislature last year. It also, of course, made a difference that as part of this whole movement of people coming into power, that a Democratic woman replaced a very conservative Republican man in the state legislature, changing the balance of power in the Senate. So the first time in 5 years, there was actually Democratic majorities in the legislature this year. But I want to add that without that people power, without people coming together and demanding and saying these are priority issues that we need to deal with, having Democrats in power wouldn't have made a difference. There were larger Democratic majorities 10 years ago, and these issues weren't at the forefront then. So that movement really made a difference. And I think with these multiple movements coming together, the Black Lives Matter movement, the indigenous movements we've been seeing, the youth standing up and fighting for their safety in schools now, I think part of our challenge moving forward is making sure that all of these movements are really combining to augment power and to really heighten people's ability to advocate for themselves and make sure that public policy is responding to the needs of the community and that we're not competing and somehow diluting each other's power. But I think so far what we've seen over the last year is really an augmentation of all that power coming together, in my mind, for the greater good.
Thank you, Marilyn. And I just want you to briefly, because I know this is a conversation that we've been having in political circles and amongst lawyers about the paid family leave program. Can you just very quickly, because when I'm out on the streets, I'm always asking, what do you guys think about this new paid family and medical leave that's coming? If you're like, well, I don't know anything about that. So can you just briefly, because we also have community members here too and people who are tying in, can you just tell us what that will provide?
Absolutely. And this is going to be, I think, I get emotional even thinking about it. This is something I think will really be transformative for people, for women and men and families across the state. So starting in 2020, every worker in the state of Washington will have the ability to take 12 to 18 weeks of paid leave to care for a new child, a seriously ill family member with a quite broad definition of family, or to care for their own serious health condition. It's run like a social insurance program, like unemployment insurance or Social Security. Starting in 2019, a small payroll premium will start coming out of workers' paychecks, and employers will also contribute. The typical worker at the middle wage will pay a couple bucks a week into the trust fund. And then when you're out for those longer periods of time, those 2 to 3 to 4 month periods of time, your employer's not having to pay you for that time. You're drawing wage replacement out of that trust fund. So it'll be a great program. It's going to be something, so not just people who work at Microsoft or the really great employers in our state who provide really good benefits. They won't be the only ones who get these kind of benefits, but the waitress, the small retail shop clerk, the farm worker, everybody will really have access to these benefits. So I really think this is going to be transformative for our families. We're really excited about it. And it was something that was a real coming together of advocates who had been advocating it for a long time, organized labor, women's groups, faith groups, all sorts of organizations, and the business community saying, okay, we know this is coming. We know it's not a matter of if we're going to get this, but when it's going to happen. And is it going to be just put on the ballot and an initiative happening that we don't get any say in? Or can we come to the table and actually help craft the policy? And so that's what happened last year. And it was all because of building up the power in order to really bring people to the table and say, this is happening, so either come and help us craft it, or we'll just do it ourselves.
And I'm just curious with folks who are in the audience, how many of you knew that this was happening? I'm just curious. Because a component of this is an education component, and so you'll be hearing more and more about this as information is coming out to the community. So I want to turn us over to Ceci Lopez. Ceci has recently been involved with the WSBA, the Washington State Bar Association, which is an organization of lawyers, has been working through the Leadership Institute to talk about some of the abuses and violence that are happening in the fields with farm workers. And I just want to, I'm going to read this quote before we get into Ceci's comments and about the program that they're looking at developing, just because I read this and it just reached out to me to talk about the severity of what's happening in the fields. So here's the quote. In 2012 Human Rights Watch report, several farm workers said that some supervisors and foremen view sexual relations and employees with employees as a perk of the job. An earlier EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission report, states that hundreds, if not thousands, of farm working women in California have had to have sex with supervisors to keep their jobs. Farm workers from Salinas referred to one company's field as the field of Del Calzon, or the field of panties, because so many supervisors raped women there. So to even fathom hundreds, thousands of women who are really doing the most important work of our community, right, to feed us. This is the experience that they're having in the fields. And so, Ceci, can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you're talking about with the Leadership Institute through WSBA, we call it WSBA, that they're doing?
Absolutely. So this is a current conversation as part of the Leadership Institute with the fellows. It's 12 of us, and we really trying to engage in some kind of meaningful project for the community, and this is one of the topics that's at the forefront for us. We recognize that the injustices that happen in the field go most of the time unheard. Women, especially in farms that are, far away from the city, tend to be very isolated. Eastern Washington has some of the largest farms in the state, in the country at some point, sometimes. And the conditions of the workers, it's sometimes deplorable. And the conditions of work sometimes are in addition to being very dangerous, they are very controlled by the supervisors. People live in small communities where if they come forward and speak up, the backlash comes in so many different forms. Women have to, by telling their truth or their situation, they become an object of observation, right? Suddenly everybody knows this intimate trauma that the women have suffered. Their community is aware of this thing. If they're married, that carries its own set of circumstances and shame most of the time, right? Relatives sometimes are also in supervisory positions. So they don't want to get involved because they don't want to talk, they don't want to have repercussions in their own job positions, right? So they rather not talk about it, not discuss it, not acknowledge it. So the woman's place and her testimony or her claims sometimes have no external support. So having recognized that, one of the things that we're trying to facilitate is identifying those areas where we can provide some kind of support for women. So one of the initiatives is to start providing bystander education and teaching people how to be a source of support for women who find the courage to bring their complaints forward. Most of these cases, the complaint may be very valid, but with lack of witnesses, it makes it very difficult for the prosecutors or for the attorneys representing the women to make a very solid case and create significant change. So through the Leadership Institute, that's one of the possibilities. We also want to create a hotline so people have a very direct way to communicate their complaints, staffed by a person who is bilingual, Spanish and English to begin with, but we also recognize that there are other women from other nationalities and language needs that possibly could be addressed in the future. And as we talk about women and farm worker women, I also want to mention that another segment of population that is often overlooked is domestic workers. Women who work in private homes are very invisible to the rest of society. And unfortunately, there's a lot of abuse that occurs behind those closed doors. Sometimes it's abuses that we would say, that how can that even happen here? And I have the benefit. My mom is a domestic worker in Chicago, and she has a lot of friends who are here undocumented, and the conditions under which they work are horrendous. She has friends that my mom had to sneak phones to them behind a fence so the women could have contact with the outside world. Because if the employer says, you're not going anywhere, and they lock the doors, the women have absolutely nothing, no way to get the help or the assistance they need. So, that's another segment of the population that we don't acknowledge or talk about, but they are incredibly isolated. My mom tried to join labor unions and try to reach out to organizations to get help for some of her friends, and it was incredibly difficult. The language was a barrier, the access to the workers was a barrier, and that's actually something very similar with farm worker women and domestic worker women, that the accessibility to the services is incredibly difficult. And women and farm workers sometimes live in the farms where it's completely controlled by the employer. The farmer provides the housing, the farmer provides the food, so people are not even allowed to go on themselves to the store, but there's bosses that take them to the store and bring them back. So it's a very controlled environment. So it's a big issue.
Yes, thank you, Ceci. I think we're also seeing with conversations around H-2A visas, the guest worker program, and I don't know how many of you have been following that conversation, but it's taking what is occurring with farm workers in the field and escalating the isolation and the opportunity for continued oppression. And I don't know if many of you are aware, we lost a farm worker this summer up on a farm up in our community, up in the Northwest. And so we're really seeing the opportunity for abuse escalating through the H-2A visa program. So thank you for sharing that communication. I also want to point out for people who want opportunity for learning beyond this conversation, there's two videos that have come out from Frontline. One is Rape in the Fields. I know there were some community showings recently that labor unions and community organizations put on, and also Rape on the Night Shift is another opportunity, whether you can share it in classrooms, share it with your friends or other people who want to have a better understanding of what's happening. Okay, so I want to I'm going to transition into Jamal, and I think this is a good segue because Jamal, I know you've also had experience with sex abuse cases with farm workers, but I also want you to share some of your thoughts around the separate scales of justice and some of your experiences as a plaintiff as well, about what it takes, right, for a woman to come forward. So plaintiff's attorney would generally, for our community members who are not legal practitioners, there would be a lawyer that would be in private practice that you would bring your issue to, and the plaintiff represents the employee generally. And so sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. But what is the conversation that you have with employees about what it's going to take to be a plaintiff? Also about the benefits and negativities of class action. How do we build communities around a plaintiff? So share with us what you want to share with us, Jamal, about your experience. And I also knew you were with EEOC.
That's right.
As well. So you have a wide breadth of experience on this subject.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you all for coming down today. I mean, this is a really important issue. And I mean, there's a real public reckoning that's taking place right now around sexual harassment, right? In that abusers, harassers are being called to account. But it's not as if sexual harassment or these issues are at all new, right? I mean, we all know that this has been a pervasive issue for a very long time. I mean, I look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VII, which outlaws discrimination on the basis of sex. We saw the slides that you had earlier with the women that came forward really pushing the issue of sexual harassment. You've got Supreme Court cases in the late 70s and the mid 80s outlawing the creation of a hostile work environment on the basis of sex. So the question then becomes, I mean, what is it about this moment that things have gained such traction? And I don't know that I have an answer, but I will say that as someone that I consider myself on the front lines of working for equality in the workplace, I'm thankful that we've gotten to a place where people are coming forward and asserting their rights. I mean, we've got these laws on the books. They're there for a reason. They're there to protect people. I mean, there's a metaphorical and in some cases a literal contract right in the workplace. I go to work, I do my thing. Hopefully I get along with my coworkers. Maybe I don't, but I get paid. I go home to my family. So when you've got a boss or coworkers that mess with that equation, right, that put impediments in front of you going to work and doing your thing and earning a living to provide for your family, I've got a problem with that, and so does the law, thankfully. So, I'm glad we're in a place where people are coming forward. The strength that it takes to finally stand up and say, I'm not going to take this anymore is just tremendous. So when people come to my office, I mean, the first thing that I tell them is, I just, commend you on the strength that it takes to pick up the phone or to get on the internet, to make an appointment with the lawyer, come down to my office and sit across this conference table from me to talk about this horrible treatment that you may have endured. So it takes people coming forward to have that conversation. Ceci was talking about rape in the fields. And I mean, it literally is, in some cases, rape in the fields. I was at the EEOC for 4 years as a senior trial attorney there. And I worked cases in Eastern Washington where you've got foremen that literally rule over little fiefdoms within the orchards. They have absolute power over the workers in their charge. If they choose to call out a young woman or several young women and to abuse them horribly, unfortunately, they feel emboldened that they can do something. And it's sad to me that in the current climate that victims of rape would be reluctant to come forward to law enforcement for fear of deportation. But the good thing about, the law, Title VII and Washington Law Against Discrimination, it doesn't care whether or not you are documented. The bottom line is if you are abused in the workplace, you've got recourse. So, we talk about, Metoo and the movement as if it's a monolith. And it's not. I mean, you've got sort of this issue of intersectionality in that you've got women of color, black and brown women, that are experiencing sexual harassment in a way that perhaps their white peers, their white counterparts aren't. I mean, it's, I think, obvious to everyone in the room that as Me Too began, we were dealing with beautiful white actresses, rich folks that are coming forward with their stories. But the stories are painfully familiar in a way, but you look at black and brown women that have perhaps similar stories to tell, and for whatever reason, they're marginalized. We don't give, their stories the same credence. So, as we look at Me Too, as we look at claims in the workplace, I would hope that, we would evaluate and look at the claims on par without regard to whether or not we are dealing with a Caucasian woman, a black woman, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you are, a high-powered executive or an hourly worker, and to listen to these folks as they come forward with their stories and make things hopefully better for everyone. I mean, the way I look at it is it's not a zero-sum game in the sense that a women's victory is men's loss or a white woman's gain is a black woman's loss. I mean, I think the metaphor that I like to think of is sort of a rising tide in the sense that it lifts all boats. So to the fact that the extent that Me Too has brought awareness to these issues, to the fact that men are analyzing, what am I doing? How are these actions perceived? To the fact that people are coming forward with claims, I think it's all to the betterment of the workplace and bringing sort of respect and equality to all workers.
Thank you for that. And it's a really interesting conversation around, when I'm reading through and preparing for this event, and we're talking about some of the conversation that's happening around, can I still ask my coworker out? Can I still hug my coworker? Can I date my coworker? Can I date my subordinate? And really what's interesting around this is that that's really not what it's about. This is about sexual violence. This is about sexual abuse. This is about abuse of power. This is about privilege. This is not about consensual relationships or about sex or about love. It's about violence. And the languaging that we're doing around this is so archaic and really dominated by privilege and power. So thank you for sharing that communication. And I think one of the things that has been communicated is about this need that if people are going to come forward, especially people who do not have power in our community, that don't have the money or the class or the ethnicity privilege or all of the language privileges or documented status privilege, how are we going to create networks of coming forward? And I do want to say we definitely have community leaders here in this room that hopefully will come forward. I know LaTanya Horace is here today, and hopefully we'll talk about some of the work that's happening in the community. Yvonne Chin and Riddy are both here from the Sexual Violence Legal Services, and hopefully others. Please let us know that you're here, because if we're building communities of support out there, please let us know so that we can share that with the larger public. So I want to shift us on to Elizabeth Beth to talk with us about, Beth is the person that an employer calls when they need an investigation. Somebody has come forward in the workplace that says, this is happening to me, me too. And so Beth gets called to do the investigation. And so I'm hoping Beth can share, if you're a person out there that's thinking about coming forward, what that experience is going to be like, what your interaction with an investigator is going to be like, what an investigator looks like when they come into the room. And so Beth, share with us a little bit about is there a risk of harm? What does it mean to be an independent investigator but still paid by an employer? And what it's like to move through the conflict. And also, I'm assuming that you have experiences where you're thinking, gosh, employer, like if you had only done, or why didn't you? Or why is this a difficult conversation? So maybe share that with us. Yeah, how did I get here?
First of all, I don't usually look this stuffy when I do investigation because I think it's vital that I am able to make a connection with the person I'm speaking to, be they a complainant or a witness, because if they're not comfortable, they're not going to be able to relate their story to me. And if I can't get as much of their story as possible, I can't help. So this is this is not my norm. It is, I'm certain, an incredibly difficult thing to make a complaint. And then to meet with somebody you've never even heard of before and tell them an incredibly personal event or events or series of events that you're pretty sure this person is not going to believe or has already been paid off by the employer to not believe, because I am being paid by the employer. And I get that question a lot right off the bat. You're being paid by the employer, by my boss. Why should I even tell you anything? And I will tell you exactly what I tell them, or what I will tell you if I ever have the chance to meet you, if you have a complaint. And that is that I am here as an independent investigator. Yes, my time is being paid for by your employer, but your employer has a legal duty to look into your complaint, and they have a legal duty to make sure that that investigation is done as independently and fairly as possible. My job is to determine the facts. It is not to determine the law. It is to determine whether or not a policy has been violated. Hopefully there is a policy, there is a handbook. That's another story entirely. I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to talk about what's wrong with our company's policies in the first place and why we're still dealing with harassment, why I believe we're still dealing with harassment in the workplace. One of the reasons is those darn policies. But I'm not here to make the legal determination or to decide what happens after I've done a report. Unfortunately, that's not my job either. But I have to get the story in order to help. If I don't have the story and I don't have the witnesses and I don't have a chance to confront the situation and write it all down and put it into a report, I can't help. And that means not only can't I help that particular person, but I can't help the next person either. And I can't help the other people who are being subjected to this right now if it's a situation of a hostile work environment based on sex or based on class or based on, not class, gender or race or religion or whatever I'm there to investigate. I like to think I usually am able to get the story. I often have people tell me that they've told me a lot more than they intended to. So that makes me feel good. I think it's important. It's the only way that the situation can be resolved at the workplace. It is true that people can quit and people can move forward with an attorney and they can bring a claim after having quit. Jamal can tell you there's a whole lot of legal issues that come up when that happens. But if they want to resolve the situation as best they can and remain in their job, an investigation that looks into the situation and hopefully even has, and maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but has an opportunity to heal the situation, is best done with an investigation. I talk to this person. I will spend anywhere from 2 hours to the longest I've ever spent with any witness was 18 hours. She had been there a long time, and she had a lot to talk about. Getting their story, getting their witnesses, and then I will go meet those witnesses. And then I will get their stories. And then last but not least, I will meet with the respondent and get his or her story. And then I'll go back and I'll meet with the witnesses again and the complainant again, because more often than not, the respondent says, no, I didn't do that, or here's why I did that, or this is the context of that, and then I need to find out what everybody else says about that. So it's sort of a round and round. I have to make a credibility determination more often than not. There are a lot of ways I can do that. It's not usually he said, she said. There's usually a lot of other factors that come into play. There's almost always documentation. There's almost always a witness to somebody's demeanor. There's almost always something in a timeline that doesn't play out. Someone who says this happened during this time frame, but it just isn't going to work that way. Or their story is just, that someone always. Anyway, there are credibility determinations that I have to make that are hard. They are hard, but there's usually a legitimate way to make those determinations. I put it into a report, and I give that report to the employer. Whether or not the employer chooses to share it with the employee is up to them or up to Jamal. And I have nothing to do with that part either. And then I step back and I wait for Jamal to call me and put me on the stand.
As a witness in the lawsuit.
Yep. And I hope I've done a good job for either, for everybody. I hope I've been a neutral investigator and I have done a good, fair, thorough job of interviewing everybody and getting as much evidence and considering everybody's side of the story.
So real quick, before we move into audience interaction opportunity, I just want to ask, because I know you're also active in the AWI, which is an organization of investigators that helps with training and certification and whatnot. And I'm curious, how much conversation have you been hearing around investigator implicit bias and also having have the investigation not be an additional form of trauma, and having that conversation. Have you been hearing that happening out there, or not quite yet, or where are we in that?
It's definitely happening. Implicit bias is something, obviously, that we take into consideration as investigators. It's part of the certification course. It's part of the study. It's something we consider, implicit bias being what we bring to the table as investigators. We're human too. I try to be as aware constantly of the things I do and say as a human being, as everyone else, I think, who's evolved or woke, is the new way of saying it, if I can use that word in my 50s. I try, but I can only be as aware as I am. That said, I certainly have seen situations where I'm stunned at what other investigators, and seen case law where I'm stunned at what other investigators have missed. And I'm grateful that I live in the Pacific Northwest. As to the trauma of what I put a witness through, I know that it's a huge issue, and one that unfortunately we are only now, after 23 years of doing employment law, really starting to become aware of. I am lucky, and I count my blessings, that I have not had a lot of sexual assault cases. I don't know why, but I'm grateful, because those situations obviously bring into play a whole lot more in the world of PTSD than the ones where there aren't assault. That does not mean, however, that there isn't emotional distress that comes from any sort of discrimination or harassment that somebody's subjected to. And one of the things, and I know we've got time limits, but we're talking about Vinson and the quid pro quo that she was subjected to. That was the first form of sexual harassment that the Supreme Court considered. It was much later, and I want to say it was the early 90s, but I might be wrong, that Harris versus Forklift was heard by the Supreme Court, and that was the first hostile work environment case where there was no physical assault, There was no you have to do this for that. She was simply subjected to an environment that was hostile based on her gender. She was subjected to the calendars and the comments and the jokes and the things that the Supreme Court said keep her from being successful in her job because she's female. And those are the cases that are more difficult as an investigator, and I imagine as a plaintiff's lawyer. And we don't see, unless we're dealing with the truly vulnerable farm workers and domestic workers, we don't see as many quid pro quo cases anymore. We see hostile work environment cases, which are a newer.
Well, and for those who aren't lawyers that are listening in or in the room, the quid pro quo is this for that. If you give me this, you'll be able to keep your job. A condition of your employment is to have a relationship in some way with me. So that's that quid pro quo knowledge. I just want to clarify that. So we have a few minutes here, about 12 minutes for audience interaction. And again, for those folks who have just walked in recently or walked in after my comments originally, please talk about the organization that you're with and your name so that we create the opportunity for interaction here beyond this. So let's start first with an audience question and then maybe move on to our online as it comes in. And so a mic will be coming your way. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Daskowitz, and I work at Seattle Children's, but I've been a defense-side employment lawyer for 30 years. And clearly, we've done really a crummy job of training. We've had requirements to train in workplaces for most of those 30 years, and the kind of training that I've given and I've sat through far too many times obviously doesn't work. And so people continue to have questions about what's consensual or not consensual in the workplace. And I'm very worried that one of the things that's going to come out in Washington State, where we now have a blue ribbon task force looking at best practices in training, because I'm sure that's one of the bills that got signed yesterday, that we're going to do something like say, 2 hours of mandatory training every year. And that's not how adults learn. And we know that now. Maybe we didn't know it 30 years ago when California passed its law. But how are we going to effectively communicate these new ideas to people and do it in a practical way so that when we trained 30 years ago, and now we've got, I don't mean to be condescending, but it's a little condescending, the tech bros who act surprised that anti-harassment laws apply to them. Clearly something has gotten missed, and I'd love to hear what you folks think about that. And then, is it Michelle Vinson, Vinson?
On the slide. It's Vin.
I just want to make sure, because in case people are trying to look up that case, if they look up venison, they won't end up in the right place. But anyway, I'd love to hear about your thoughts about training.
Well, I think as Carrie said, part of this really is about, a lot of this, it's really all about power and who has the power. And hopefully one of the things that we're doing as a culture now, not just in the U.S., because the Metoo movement has gone worldwide at this point, or not, to a lot of other countries at least, is that it really is putting this stuff out in the public dialogue. So people are actually talking about it. And people feel much more empowered. The law does give people, I think we've tried to give people practical new tools in the laws that have been passing in the last few years, so that you can discuss your wages. Those non-disclosure agreements aren't going to be valid. Those kinds of things. People have those new tools, but just the fact that people know that they can talk about it and there's going to be someone to have their back, I think is a really different thing than feeling like you're going to be completely socially isolated and completely economically vulnerable, because the economic vulnerability is a really big part of it. I don't know that there's one unique solution. I think this task force that did get set up as to set up the model safe workplace policies, there will be a public process, so anyone who has ideas about what should go into that, or what beyond mandatory trainings needs to be part of that model policy, please participate in that process and let if you have expertise, let people know about it.
Kamal, did you want to get, yeah.
I mean, I think for me, conceptually, I don't see anything wrong with some sort of annual or regular requirement. I mean, you've got OSHA requirements where it talks about, safe handling of heavy equipment or how to, load the boxes on the truck, all of that. I mean, so there are regular safety requirements in other contexts that workers have to undergo. So it makes sense to me that you would also do something along the lines of sexual harassment. I think for me, the training dovetails with the whole idea of just having paper policies. I mean, if every employer of any sort of sophistication has a bunch of EEO statements about how they love and value diversity and hate harassment and all of that stuff. Don't harass people. Okay, got it. But what does that really mean in terms of the workplace, right? Do you have the folks that are in the C-suite, the executives, the managers that are attending those trainings and then taking them seriously? Are you fostering an environment in which that type of behavior is not only unacceptable, but if you're witnessing it happening, you are going to report it, even though you're not the victim or the target of the behavior, right? So to me, I think training and just sort of bringing the issue to the fore is crucial. David Schwimmer, of all people, just created a series of PSAs. And they're these little 1 minute or 30-second shorts, but they're excellent because, I mean, they're called, I think, That's Harassment. And it's just a series of little tiny interactions where it's just, for lack of a better word, it's just sketchy behavior on the part of a coworker. And, I think the situations that really break my heart the most are in the restaurant industry. You've got young women where perhaps this is their first job. And, okay, my friends and I, we joke a certain kind of way, right, outside of work. Why can't I joke like this at work? And everything, it's fun. We're just joking. Everyone's laughing at first at work. And then it escalates. And it's a touch on the small of your back. And then it's, constant hands on the shoulder. And then the next thing you know, you are trapped in a confined space with a predator, right? So I think, trainings and, getting that conversation, starting that dialogue, whether it's voluntary or mandatory, is all to the betterment of the workplace.
I would add on to that a couple of things that I, not just as an investigator, but I also do some advice work afterwards and even before with employers, and training. Training should not be pushing a button on a computer. That's
okay. For the DMV.
A doesn't work. Oh, I'm supposed to push B then. B doesn't work. Okay, I'll push C. I mean, nobody's reading it. Training should be interactive. Training should be different. People should know their managers are having training. They should know that their managers are also being subjected to training. They should know. Paper policies should say things like, you are required to not see something, say something, but if you see something, you are required to say something. Not, you are responsible for your coworkers. If you are a manager, you are not only responsible, but hello, this is Washington State. You're legally liable if you don't say something. I don't think people realize that as managers until their name's on the pleading, right, Jamal?
Deposition notice, right?
Or they've been served. Right. And then while we're at it, the policy should also say, make sure if you report it to somebody, to HR, that HR has done something about it because you're responsible for it. Turning it over to HR is not enough. I mean, there are a lot of things about becoming responsible for this activity, for this sort of activity that we need to do as a society that shouldn't stop because we're in our employer's domain. I think the policies and the training are just the start, but these things obviously haven't been working, and we need to change them. They shouldn't just be EEOC recitations.
Yeah, so I don't know if we had an online question next or if we're going straight to the audience.
Do you have one out there? Mm-hmm. Let's take the audience question, and then I have a good online one.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is LaTanya Horson. I'm a community advocate, and I've worked in mainstream domestic violence, sexual assault work in the greater Seattle area over the past 20 years and have been for the past 12 directly in the community. We call it the Underground Railroad. And the reason we call it that is because beneath folks, brown and black, women do not report and don't feel enabled to do so because there is much implicit bias. And so I say to you, consider those who do not report. Young girls and women, we don't report. We don't report, and there are various reasons why, because we just don't trust the systems that govern us, because they're very oppressive on the other side. So I think it's great work that you're doing in all the movements that are coming together and building power, but we almost sit on an island. It feels like we are on an island as Black and brown women, because this is a historical issue for us, not just in the workplace, but historically as us being in this country. And it's not been addressed. It's not even addressed in our community. We have young girls that are being preyed upon and experiencing sexual violence. And, we reach out, we call folks, the right folks, and the answer is, well, she'll have to testify. I'm like, she'll testify, right? But how's she going to live in that community still? Because the perpetrator's family or his gang members or anybody else he knows lives there. So she's never going to be safe doing that. So there's many reasons why we don't report. And in the workplace, there's so much stereotype and stigma around just being a Black woman. And I've seen, in the past year, several young women be assaulted and nothing be done about it, even to the point to where they didn't want to say anything because they just wanted it to go away and they didn't want to be re-victimized, which is what often happens, the re-traumatizing, the re-victimizing. So I say to you, when you launch your education, make it accessible. Consider those who are voiceless, please, because we are always left out of the conversation. I mean, the Metoo movement, I think it's a great thing, but it's like, come on, that's not new. It's just you're pretty, you're white, and you're rich. And now we can really draw the attention to it. So it's not that we don't stand beside other women who've experienced this, but consider for one moment, it has been our existence in this country. And it's been for many, many years, and it's been a silent existence. And we still hold that silence, not because we want to be silenced, but we have no recourse. We're not protected. We don't have any safety beyond the reporting. So when you do the trainings, make it accessible for young women, young brown and Black women, not just women. I mean, because I work in communities where young folks work. We have a poverty issue here in Washington, and our young folks have to work, and they're encountering the same thing at 14, 15, wherever they can get work. And so they need to know, too, that they have rights.
So I would, as an investigator and as a trainer, I would appreciate time with you, because I need to be able to find a way as a white woman to have a conversation with women who need to report. I'm sitting with them. They've reported, but they need to talk to me. And I need to be able to find a way to relate or have them relate to me. I am who I am. I can only bring them so far. And when I do the training, I can only do so much. So I would love time with someone who would give me, an hour even before I do a training in a place where I'm going to be talking to women, young women like that, so that I can make sure I'm going to reach them and their peers.
So real quick, Beth, and I know, Ceci, you want to jump in here quickly. I just want to say really quickly, and then I'm going to turn it to Ceci to close us out. But I do want to say that LaTanya has come here today and called us out at the WSBA office. We are lawyers. We are people of power and privilege. We have an obligation to do our own education for ourselves and to learn about our biases, to reach out and learn about communities. But the work has to start from the inside out, right? So, Ceci, close us out and tell us where we're going to go from here.
Thank you. So thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's one of the issues that we want to address is like women who report carry the whole weight on their shoulders. All the obligation is on her to do all the work, all the re-traumatizing. And with the bystander trainings, what we're trying to do is those who are observing carry part of that burden and help this woman, yes, tell her story and do that testifying, but knowing that she's not alone, that when she needs it, those witnesses are going to be there supporting and sharing what they've seen and what they've known. So we're hoping that by lifting some of that weight, she would be more likely to come forward.
Thank you so
we're at
much.
time.
Sorry, Carrie. I will let you get the last word, and then I'll finish this off.
Didn't have anything additional. I'm just grateful for this conversation and for the work that has happened before us and the work that will come after us, and for also for the call out we had today as attorneys to clean up what's happening. All right, Megan, take us out.
I think it's a good point. I think we have achieved what we came to achieve, the opportunity to learn and to make those connections. Thank you to our panel and our amazing moderator. We are so grateful for having you. Thank you for everyone who chimed in online and in person. I wish these events were 3 hours because we have a lot of work to do. And I think if you're staying here, we have the room for a little bit. So feel free to continue the conversation offline. My apologies to the webcast audience, of course. And join us next quarter. We will be doing the rule of law on May 1st, which is Law Day. More details to come. So please, everyone in-house, big round of applause for our panel.